Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Rausan Pereira. In a blow to Pakistan, the Financial Action Task Force placed it on the grey list for failing to curb anti-terror financing despite Islamabad submitting a 26-point action plan and launching a concerted diplomatic effort to avert the decision. The decision was taken late on Wednesday night at the Global Financial Watchdog Financial Action Task Force plenary session in Paris, where Finance Minister Shamshad Akhtar represented Pakistan. The FATF is an intergovernmental body established in 1989 to combat money laundering, terrorist financing and other related threats to the integrity of the international financial system. The placement on the grey list could hurt Pakistan's economy as well as its international standing. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze FATF's move. Joining me on the program today are T.C.A. Raghavan, former diplomat, Professor Pant, Head Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation, and Tilak Devasher, former Special Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Mr. Devasher, let me begin with you first, of course, and let's try and put into perspective why the FATF has put Pakistan on the grey list.
Well, you know, the compliance of Pakistan with anti-money laundering as well as curtailing terror financing has been poor. And in February, when the plenary meeting was last held in Paris, Pakistan should have been put on the grey list at that time, but it was postponed till June because Pakistan did not have an action plan ready. So Pakistan was given up to May to prepare this action plan. It prepared an action plan which the Asia Pacific Group in a meeting in Bangkok in May threw out and said that you better prepare another plan. If you don't, or if the plan is not accepted, then you will get blacklisted. So Pakistan prepared this action plan of 26 points, which was submitted in Paris. It has been accepted. So Pakistan is on the grey list. So basically, Pakistan's compliance with the international watchdogs regulatory mechanisms has been very poor all these years, despite the fact that they were let off the grey list in 2015 conditionally. Despite this, Pakistan has not put into place the mechanisms that it should have, which the rest of the world has. There are a few countries that haven't, but most of the world has. So this is what the watchdog has pointed out and finally caught Pakistan, that you are not complying with anti-money laundering legislation as well as curbing terror financing. That's why Pakistan is where it is.
You know, Ambassador, Mr. Devasher was talking about the action plan. A 26-point action plan was, provided by Pakistan as far as dealing with this particular issue is concerned. Was the action plan not good enough? Do you believe that Pakistan should have been in the blacklist rather than the grey list?
Well, the FATF, according to its procedures, has a graded system of how it evaluates different country situations. The only two countries presently on the blacklist are North Korea and Iran. And this is because of the accumulated history of the international communities dealing with these two countries. Possibly for this reason, Pakistan as a first step has been put on the grey list. And there is a feeling certainly amongst many members of the FATF itself that possibly this step would be enough and no further steps would be required. The fact is, Pakistan has a very poor compliance record, because as was mentioned earlier, it was earlier on the grey list from 2013 to 2015, was let off, and then a number of infringements have been noted in the past 2 or 3 years, where despite that earlier record of being on the grey list, it has again fallen into non-compliance.
Indeed. You know, talking about the FATF itself, Professor, let's try and put into perspective what the FATF is, what does it do, how does it function, and who comprises the FATF?
Well, it's a very important mechanism now that, as you pointed out earlier, set up in the late 1980s to put together a framework whereby you can actually take care of terror financing and money laundering mechanisms. And I think what we have seen increasingly is that it has become a very central instrument in the way international community comes together in fighting terrorism. It was seen as relatively ineffective in the early years, but increasingly, as we have seen the changing nature of global terrorism and how it functions and how sophisticated it has become in terms of financing and how it manages to cross border at will, and how these interconnections develop, I think its role in managing these tensions amongst countries and how the international order needs to tackle global terrorism is becoming more and more central, and therefore the debate that you witness now about Pakistan becomes so critical, because Pakistan, as was mentioned earlier, apart from Iran and North Korea, is the third country which tends to be in the spotlight. And I think it tells you a story about Pakistan's role in global terrorism, and also I think a larger story about what sort of a consensus now is developing around Pakistan's role. Initially, when India used to make the case, it used to be India versus Pakistan. Now I think it's Pakistan versus the rest of the international community, and I think that's an evolution in terms of Indian diplomacy, a success of Indian diplomacy, as well as a recognition by the international community itself that unless Pakistan is managed, a lot of these problems that emanate from Pakistan around how terrorism, the tentacles of terrorism has grown across the world, will not be managed. I would just like to add that I think there is a consensus now, and that consensus is evolving around Pakistan. But if you read carefully China's statement, it has made a very interesting statement about the positive impact that Pakistan is having in this war, and how the world needs to recognize those positive challenges. So I think the challenge there is going to be that China increasingly will also try to play a role that it has played in other fora in protecting Pakistan.
Indeed, that's something that I wanted to take up as well. China's role in all of this. We'll talk about that in just a bit. But before that, Mr. Devasher, what happens to a country that is put on the FATF grey list?
See, there is something called a mutual evaluation. Now, this 26-point action plan which has been prepared has not been prepared by Pakistan alone. It's been prepared in consultation with the Asia Pacific group. They have a ICRG, and together they have given certain steps. Of these 26 points, I think 9 are supposed to be implemented by January 2019, 13 by May 2019, and the balance by September 2019. So Pakistan will have to comply. In fact, it will have to reformulate its administrative and financial structures, and especially in terms of the in choking down on financing of groups like the Lashkar, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Haqqani network, the Taliban. It will have to demonstratively prove that it has choked down their finances, it has taken over their assets, it has frozen their assets and taken them over. Now, people are going to be watching this very closely. Unfortunately for Pakistan, the fact that a lot of these people who are recognized as international terrorists are contesting elections. The Hafiz Saeed's so-called Milli Muslim League is contesting about 265 seats, both in the national and the provincial assembly. The Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat has been taken off the banned list the day the FATF decision came. And the Election Commission has no mechanism to determine who is on the proscribed list or not. I'll give you an example. In September 2017, when the by-election to Lahore took place after Nawaz Sharif was removed as from Prime Minister, a person by the name of Qari Yaqub, who is a member of the Central Advisory Committee of the Jamaat-ud-Dawa, contested, and he got the third largest number of seats, though he is a globally designated terrorist. Now, out of these people, we don't know how many are going to be actually terrorists. So, I'm sure the FATF is going to be looking at this also very closely, that you have a 26-point action plan, but what is the implementation? And I think this is where Pakistan will have to really pull up its socks. Or come September 2019, the FATF is going to decide, well, there has been very poor compliance.
Indeed. Ambassador, why is it that the Pakistanis have failed to comply? Why is it that they have failed to stop or choke terror funding in the past? Is it that easy really for the Pakistanis to curb terror funding? Because like Mr. Devasher pointed out, most of these terrorists, most of these terror organizations are extremely influential in Pakistan. They wield a lot of political power as well. So it's difficult really to go after them.
Well, it is certainly not an easy, process for Pakistan to undertake, and they have built up over the years a number of arguments which justify as to how difficult this is, because they say the economy is largely still a cash-driven economy. It's very difficult to control the extent of cash transactions. And for the past decade and a half, beginning from the time when many of these groups were first put under UN financial sanctions, these kind of arguments did have a certain credibility. But that credibility has worn thin. The Jamaat-ud-Dawa, for instance, has been on the UN sanctions list in terms of financial transactions for over a decade now. But in the same period, it's one of its affiliates, which is also listed by the United Nations, has built up a huge ambulance service. And the United Nations Security Council team, which goes into these issues, wanted to ask as to how can such a large service, a system of ambulances be built up when the group concerned is under financial sanction. This was the Falah-i-Insaniat. And the Pakistanis had really no convincing answer for this. So I think the current situation and earlier the situation when it was put under the grey list for the first time is a result of accumulated evidence coming from a number of quarters that arguments are being devised on grounds of difficulty. But in fact, the reason for non-compliance is a systemic mindset of denial that actually there's nothing very wrong and the world is targeting us deliberately or consciously and overlooking our own sacrifices for fighting terrorists. I think this mindset is really at the core of the issues which Pakistan faces today.
If the Pakistanis really want to, they can actually put an end to it, is what you're suggesting.
That's what my impression is.
Okay. You know, Professor, being put on the grey list, what kind of an impact is it going to have on Pakistan? Is it going to have any impact on their economy? Is it going to have any impact on their political standing globally? What's going to happen there?
Well, I don't think they care much about their political standing globally, because if they would not be doing certain things that they are doing in terms of what they think are their strategic interests and what sort of a response they demand. But I think certainly in terms of economy, that's going to have impact, as I think the issue is that they have to go to IMF for loans, and that would have an impact on, they will have to fulfill certain conditions if they want to get those loans. But again, I'm not so sure if, there is a certain nonchalance about this in Pakistan, which they think that somehow Chinese are going to come and bail them out every time, which may or may not be true. But I think that is something that they certainly take into account when they respond to such sort of approbation that comes their way time and again. And it is not the first time. I mean, FATF is one mechanism, but we have seen other mechanisms as well, which have sort of marginalized Pakistan, which have demanded responses from Pakistan. And I think, and as the ambassador was pointing out, they've always had a response that may not be in sync with the ground reality, and it may not be in sync with what a large part of the global public opinion says. But I think the larger institutional framework within which Pakistan operates perhaps feels that this is something that they can get away with. So I doubt whether they would be really worried about their global standing. But I think the shoe can really pinch when it comes to the economic matters, where I think we have seen the kind of debt pressure that they are under, especially with regard to CPEC, the kind of debt that they've taken over. They have gone to China a number of times. China has sort of given them some support a few times, but the larger reality remains that the debt is huge. Whether or not they
and the purse will eventually close someday.
Yeah, someday. And I think they've always had this relationship with IMF, which somehow they have managed to convince America time and again that economic collapse would be a great catastrophe. I doubt very much whether the West at this point is in sync with that argument, but I think the Chinese certainly can help, and they may be relying on this kind of statement that I earlier mentioned from China to sort of shore up that legitimacy. If China, as the world's emerging superpower, says that look, we have to acknowledge Pakistani sacrifices, then perhaps many in Pakistan would feel that is something that again gives them a shield to protect their responses and to shape their responses in the coming days and months.
Mr. Devasher, how far is China going to go to protect their all-weather friend Pakistan?
Well, they will certainly go out on a limb, but not when it pinches their own purse. I was reading recently, the 16 billion rupees, almost $1.6 billion or more than that Pakistan has to repay for one coal power plant, which is the Sahiwal coal power plant. They're not able to do that. And the Chinese consortium and the Chinese companies and the Chinese banks are extremely worried that if this is the state of affairs in repayment of one coal power plant, where now it is coming online, they have to repay the power purchase plus repay of the loans plus the profit. What is going to happen to the rest of the investments? So, the Chinese will certainly protect Pakistan to the extent that they can, but when their own banking system is going to get impacted by the money that Pakistan owes to them, they will certainly have a rethink. I'm not saying they will pull the rug, but they will certainly have a rethink on what or where Pakistan is headed. And I think in the past, if the experience is to go by, Chinese have always advised Pakistan to go to international financial institutions. Go to the IMF, go to the World Bank, go to the ADB. China will bail out Pakistan $500 million, maybe $1 billion, they'll park in their reserves. But when it comes to $6 or $7 billion, Pakistan in the next 1 year has to repay $13 billion. it is not in a position, the exports are falling, their imports are rising, the current account deficit is going haywire. Where is Pakistan going to get this kind of money from? IMF is the only organization, international organization, and Chinese will tell them that you go to the IMF, whatever the conditionalities are. But with this FATF grey listing, and secondly, let me just say that even before the FATF decision was taken, Moody's have already downgraded the credit rating of Pakistan from stable to negative. This is about a week before the FATF decision. Now, how that will impact, and the rupee has been devalued 4 times in the last 6 months. From 105 rupees, it's gone up to 122 rupees. So, all this cumulatively is building up tremendous economic pressure on Pakistan, which the new government is going to inherit as soon as it takes over. So, China, I think the jury is still out. It will bail out Pakistan to the extent it can, but I don't think so it will do all the heavy lifting by itself.
Sure. The times ahead certainly look extremely difficult as far as Pakistan is concerned. Even during the UN HRC, of course, on the Kashmir issue, we saw that everyone was against Pakistan. Countries across continents coming and joining India and supporting India on that front, Ambassador. So, could China be the real problem as far as we are concerned?
Well, I don't think the matter is going to be going to play out in those terms, because the FATF listing has an immediate impact on Pakistan transaction costs, quite regardless of what China does. I mean, Pakistan has an outward orientation in its economy with countries other than China too, and their transaction costs are going to go up. Again, it's a cumulative process. Last year, the Habib Bank, Pakistan's largest bank, its operations were shut down in the United States. Now comes the FATF grey listing. So each of these factors leads to an increase in transaction costs, and as was mentioned, the shoe starts pinching. China can't possibly bail out Pakistan in each and every one of its interfaces with different markets, whether in textiles, whether in dealings with the financial community. So in my view, this situation is difficult for Pakistan, but it's by no means unprecedented.
Okay.
They have faced this kind of situation before, and in some ways with the new government they will tighten their belts and try to see as to how they can meet the FATF conditions to the fullest extent.
Talking about the new government, in all likelihood we could see a new Prime Minister as far as Pakistan is concerned. Professor, is that going to change anything as on the terror front?
I very much doubt that. I have, if it's given the conditions under which the new government will take office, it's going to be largely driven by the military largesse, whether it is political or whether it's economic. I think we are going to see, given the turmoil that Pakistan is facing internally, I think their first ambition would be to somehow get a grip on the domestic situation, and the military will be there to sort of guide them as they have always done. And I think in this case particularly, the kind of the militarization of the electoral process that we have seen in Pakistan, I very much doubt if we are going to see a government that is going to be completely cut off from the military, as we had expected after the last election, that here is a government, that the democracy is being strengthened. I think that fallacy has been put to rest. What has happened in the last few in the last 2 years and the last few months in Pakistan. So I think by and large we are seeing a sort of rejuvenation of the military. And if that is the case, then a lot of these questions about here is a military that has always seen terror as a central part of its identity or instrumentality of its foreign policy. So I very much doubt that they would be willing to change that aspect of it. Certainly there is enormous pressure now on Pakistan, and with the kind of government that we have in Washington, which is very transactional, which wants to see some results on the ground, I think there will be cross-cutting pressures. But I very much doubt whether there will be a sort of a transformational change in Pakistan with the coming elections. I think it's going to be more of the same.
Indeed. So that having been said, Mr. Devasher, has terrorism gotten out of control in Pakistan, and can it be reeled in?
It's a question of the army taking a decision on what they want to do with these various terror groups. The path they are going down is mainstreaming jihadis. Now, mainstreaming per se is not a bad idea, but if you mainstream jihadis without de-weaponizing, without de-radicalization and without re-education, you're going to have jihadis sitting in parliament, which is a horrendous idea. That tomorrow, if you have, I'm not sure how many people will win, even if they don't win this election, 5 years down the road, there will certainly be a much larger presence of these mainstream, so-called mainstream jihadis. So, if this is the path that the Pakistan Army has taken to sort of mainstream jihadis, then it's obvious that Pakistan Army does not want to deal with terrorism head-on. It's okay to deal with the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is hurting Pakistani interests, but something like the Lashkar or something like the Jaish, they are quite comfortable with. And if you're comfortable with one group, you know, terrorism across the board.
And they've been given legitimacy in Pakistan.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Absolutely. So I don't see Pakistan Army pulling out. And so long as the Pakistan Army does not pull out, see, when they went into Waziristan, they went in with a lot of determination and they did this operation Zarb-e-Azb was quite effective. Of course, displacements and all are a different issue. But if they want to do it, they probably can with a lot of cost. But I don't see that determination today in the Pakistan Army that they want to tackle terrorism across the board.
Sure.
They want to keep these assets as strategic assets against India. And period. That's the main issue.
You know, taking a cue from what Mr. Devasher just said, Ambassador, you know, the international community has tried desperately in the past to try and, you know, deal with this issue of terrorism in Pakistan, because there are other countries too in the region whose interests are hurt as a result of terrorism on Pakistani soil, that is on the western border of Pakistan, of course. You know, that having been said, despite the international pressure, why haven't we seen any kind of change as far as Pakistan is concerned when it comes to terrorism?
Well, I think we have seen some changes. First of all, the domestic situation with regard to terrorists has changed pretty radically, especially after Operation Zarb-e-Azb. There is a greater extent of societal stability than there was even 5 or 6 years ago. Even on the external side, this external, the international pressure, the US pressure has seen certain changes. And I think with regard to Afghanistan, largely as a result of US pressure, we are going to see more changes. The changes are least visible with regard to the India-specific terrorist groups. And there I admit, I think there is a mindset issue in Pakistan which remains unaffected by the US pressure, by the international profile, poor image, and so on. And that has so far been an immovable object. The only way I see out of this particular conundrum is the continuing democratization of Pakistan's political space. And while that is a non-linear process, and in many ways it's a glacial process, nevertheless it is a process whose direction is very clear. This is, after all, the third election which is taking place after the end of one phase of military rule. Secondly, the kind of quality we are seeing to civil-military interactions also suggests a society and a political space which is different from that which is totally dominated by the military. I think the military or the army itself is quite surprised at the resistance which Nawaz Sharif has put up and the response he has drawn as a result of that resistance at the ground level. What will happen in the election, I think it is impossible to predict.
Yeah.
But I would say that it's an interesting election worth watching, and I don't think we should foreclose our options on the basis of Pakistan's past history.
Sure. Quick closing comment from you, Professor, on how long can we expect Pakistan to be on the grey list as far as the FATF is concerned, and what's the way forward?
Well, they have been given, as I think earlier, it was mentioned earlier, to show progress till September 2019. So they will have to move in phases and show some results, and there will be an assessment made periodically. But I think whether or not they comply with it often depends on a lot of other things, a lot of external variables, whether the international community continues to focus on this problem, whether there continues to be a consensus around the issue, and whether they feel that the pressure is biting. If they feel that the pressure is somehow being relaxed because China says something, or because American interests have moved away, or because the international community is too fractured, then I think they will have less of an incentive to sort of move ahead with the agenda that they have now put forth to the international community. Fundamentally, I think it remains to be seen whether there is going to be any transformational change in the way they approach the problem of terrorism or even terror financing, because ultimately, if you look at the present elections, we have seen many of these people related to terror groups fighting elections. Where are they getting this money from? So I think there are numerous questions about even the electoral process that we are witnessing, how that impacts the larger question of their ability to finance and to manage the question of terrorism.
Indeed. All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.